Nice to see you all. Glad you could stop by for this very special Monday episode of Rising. Briahna, hello. How was your weekend?
My weekend was great. I threw a 40th birthday party for my brother, had some out-of-town guests in, and so I'm feeling refreshed, energized, and ready to take on the news of the day.
Fantastic. I was in Memphis for a conference, Freedom Fest, and I got to meet some of our regular guests on our show. Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger were both there, so that was very nice. Also, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who I was able to hear speak. And in fact, that is what we are talking about in our A block, some controversial remarks that he made a few days ago that we want to get into. Take it away.
Well, 2024 Democratic challenger, of course, Robert F. Kennedy, has been accused of anti-Semitism after the New York Post first wrote a report alleging Kennedy claimed that COVID-19 was a genetically engineered bioweapon that could have been, quote, ethnically targeted to prevent deaths of Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese people during a press event at an Upper East Side restaurant last week. The Post writes of Kennedy's remarks, COVID-19, there was an argument that it is ethnically targeted. COVID-19 attacks certain races disproportionately. Kennedy said COVID-19 is targeted to attack Caucasians and black people. The people who are most immune are Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese. We don't know whether it was deliberately targeted or not, but there are papers out there that show the racial or ethnic differential and impact, Kennedy added. The Post's Jonathan Levine then posted video of the encounter. Here's the first part of that.
And we need to talk about bioweapons. The level, I know a lot now about bioweapons because I've been doing a book on it for the past 2.5 years, and you know, the technology that we now have to develop these microbes, we've put hundreds of millions of dollars into ethnically targeted microbes. The Chinese have done the same thing. In fact, COVID-19, there's an argument that it is ethnically targeted. COVID-19 attacks certain races disproportionately. The races that are most immune to COVID-19 are because of the structure of the genetic structure, genetic differentials among different races of the receptors. Of the ACE2 receptor. COVID-19 is targeted to attack Caucasians and black people. The people who are most immune are Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese.
And here's the second part of that video.
We don't know whether it was deliberately targeted that or not, but there are papers out there that show the racial and ethnic differential and impact to that. We do know that the Chinese are spending hundreds of millions of dollars developing ethnic bioweapons, and we are developing ethnic bioweapons. That's what all of those labs in the Ukraine are about. They're collecting Russian DNA, they're collecting Chinese DNA, so that we can target people by race.
Now, we did invite Levine on the show, but he passed on that invitation. If he changes his mind, of course, he is welcome to come and talk to us.
Kennedy has strongly denounced the Post's take on his comments, tweeting that the New York Post story is mistaken. I've never, ever suggested that the COVID-19 virus was targeted to spare Jews. I accurately pointed out during an off-the-record conversation that the U.S. and other governments are developing ethnically targeted bioweapons and that a 2021 study of the COVID-19 virus shows that COVID-19 appears to disproportionately affect certain races since the furin cleavage docking site is most compatible with blacks and Caucasians and least compatible with ethnic Chinese, Finns, and Ashkenazi Jews. In that sense, it serves as a kind of proof of concept for ethnically targeted bioweapons. I do not believe and never imply that the ethnic effect was deliberately engineered. That study is here, and then he did, in fact, link to that study. Dr. Monica Gandhi, professor of medicine and infectious disease at the University of California, San Francisco, told the Post, no, I don't see any evidence that there was any design or bioterrorism, that anyone tried to design something to knock off certain groups.
Journalist Michael Schellenberger points out that RFK Jr. was right to raise the alarm about China's bioweapons program and the debate over bioweapons research, which includes research into vaccines to protect against them, and that's long overdue. Author of the public Substack, Michael Schellenberger, will be on with us tomorrow to discuss this more in depth.
So obviously this has generated furious media coverage, denunciation, more of the, RFK Jr. is a kook, crazy person, saying all these crazy things. I think it's important to note the New York Times has a write-up of this, debunking the claims he made there. Claims by which he said, RFK Jr. said there's an argument for these things, not necessarily that he was endorsing that argument. The study he links to, so the New York Times points out in this article, first of all, this scientific journal entry doesn't make this claim about Ashkenazi Jews. It's not in there. But if you read down the whole story now, at the end, there's a little correction saying, oh, actually, I'm sorry, it does, in fact, say Ashkenazi Jews in there.
The article, whatever you want to say about RFK Jr., he tends to be lawyerly and precise about the language he uses, and it can go both ways, right? There is a way that you can say, well, technically, I didn't say I believe this, but we should be generally concerned about bioweapons. We should be concerned about COVID. There is a paper that shows that the furon cleavage site doesn't exist in Ashkenazi Jews, without actually tying that all together into an argument that COVID was a bioweapon that was designed to spare is the word that the media keeps using, but that RFK Jr. did not use, to spare Ashkenazi Jews. And then there's another way that this is being characterized as the other racial groups that are also implicated in his statements, Chinese people, the Finns, black people, are being kind of shut out of this conversation. To characterize it, I think, as him saying something very specific about Jewish people being spared this disease in a way that taps into stereotypes,
right? Because there's
historical anti-Semitic stereotypes.
There's a long history of blaming the Jewish people for the Black Plague, right? You can go back to medieval Middle Ages times, and so I think people ought to be very careful, because certainly there is anti-Semitism out there. There's also anti-Chinese sentiment, et cetera, and that we're not races are not responsible for COVID-19 or other pandemics. We are trying to get to the bottom of who is responsible. There is a theory that really, no one is responsible. It arose in natural animal spillover, and there's a theory that there are specific people responsible, people who funded dangerous research in unsafe lab conditions. This impugns our government. It impugns the Chinese government. It is certainly not, it's not race specific at all, and shouldn't be made race specific. So I understand people's frustration with going in that direction. But the study did. It is possible to have diseases that affect people based on where they are. Sickle cell anemia, right, is more affects black people. Yeah, that is a reality.
Cystic fibrosis, yes. But what's so funny, and not funny, but the irony is that Democrats in the early days of the pandemic were so sensitive to the disproportionate effects that it was having on specifically Black and brown communities, specifically the Black community. Black people, it's like a known. It's in fact the progressive thing to point out that Black people were disproportionately dying from COVID. And there's a whole host of reasons that you can attribute to that.
Black people in the U.S., though, right? US. In Africa did not have a particularly bad time with COVID,
exactly. So it's like a pre-existing condition issue. It's having low vitamin D before contracting COVID predicts bad health comes. All of these kinds of things go into it, but there was never the implication that pointing that out meant that you were racist, right? And so there is this interesting.
Well, you're allowed to point out racial differences until you're not.
That's what's a little confusing about this one. So again, I think that him yada-ing, like saying a series of things in a row, even though if he technically didn't say this, the vaccine, the virus was designed to target this population, and we know it was a bioweapon. Obviously, putting things out there in a sequence might lead people to that conclusion. And if you want to very strongly say that you're not drawing any conclusions, that you're just saying that these are things that people should be concerned about more broadly, then you should probably make that clarification. And now he has. And the media is not interested in that, probably for the same reason that the media is not interested in giving him a lot of grace in other circumstances. But I do think he has to take responsibility on sometimes using lawyerly language in a way to say technically truthful things that could be taken out of context in a way that is inaccurate and potentially even dangerous. That being said, there are people who are acting as though the possibility of the development of bioweapons is the crazy part, that the scientific study that shows that certain ethnic groups don't have this furin cleavage site is the crazy part. The Amish were part of his statement as well, and they're being kind of erased from this because I think the idea of there being a specific ethnic attack on the Amish isn't as kind of sexy in the media play as obviously charges of anti-Semitism, which for obvious reasons people are very sensitive to, and they should be. But the way this is being framed, the repeated use of the phrase, he said it would spare the Jews. It almost feels like the media is creating language that will make it more make what he said more controversial than it is. When I don't think that's necessary to have some critique of his slipperiness with some of these theories here.
Sure, and we can't just try on the whole bioweapon, the labs. Michael Schellenberger in his post about this, and I can't wait to talk more about this with him tomorrow. Points out all the exceptions in official international laws that govern whether you can have deadly pathogens in labs. There's all these kinds of exceptions. Obviously, we can't just trust. We know, unfortunately, we can't just trust the scientific community not to go meddling in things they shouldn't meddle with. Barack Obama paused the gain-of-function research, decided this was too dangerous and it can't be done anymore. And Fauci signed off on them doing it anyway because there was some technical language for exceptions, national security exceptions. You can drive a Mack truck through the hole created by those. Right. So it's just like, so I don't believe you're not crazy if you're not going to take for granted the word of the U.S. health officials or the WHO that, oh no, this is never being done and there's no kind of dangerous pathogens being held anywhere. Like, we know that's not true.
Yes, in fact, I was trying to look into this and read some of the articles that RFK Jr. was referencing to support what he was saying about the existence of this cleavage site in some groups versus others, and then to look at counter evidence in other kinds of medical journals. And I found one report from 2020 that was making the case for why COVID-19 was not a bioweapon, but the article was making two points in tandem, that it wasn't a bioweapon and that it also could not possibly have been lab leak theory. And so at that point, you're like, well, I wish we lived in a world where I could say, oh, here's the scientific consensus and it's unimpeachable and they're never wrong and all of this stuff. And I could just say, well, RFK Jr. is obviously wrong about this or what have you. But that's not the way it works. That's not the way science has ever worked. Consistencies can build over time. That is why we use the word theory in the scientific context. And I do worry, I have some empathy for the idea of wanting to say, hey, bioweapons research, generally speaking, is something that's scary and that is ongoing. We're having a national conversation about whether to send weapons that we know are deeply dangerous to children, cluster bombs, and to civilians across the world. And there's no skepticism about what those can do, and we're doing it anyway, and we're being gaslit about the wisdom of that.
Yes,
so in that context, people are going to be curious about these kinds of issues. And I do think when you're having the paper record shut it down, the New York Times writing these pieces that they have to immediately offer corrections on, because it turns out that RFK Jr. wasn't pulling all of this out of his behind.
That author we had on a couple weeks ago who wrote that book about lab leaks in general, she said something so interesting, which was that in past lab leaks, even if they happen in the anthrax in the Soviet Union, when that happened, of course, the government tries to cover it up and says it didn't come out of a lab. And then scientific experts in this community of researchers, even who are not on the payroll of that government but are elsewhere, maybe even rival governments, will back up the idea that it was not a lab leak because they have the same incentives to say it did not emerge from a lab. Right. And that is, I think, and that's happened over and over again. And that's why we can't just intrinsically trust everything we hear from these people every single time without a little bit of skepticism and pushback.
Yeah.
Well, RFK Jr. also tweeted this on the matter. How devious are the MSM attack dogs? Here is the question New York Post Jonathan Levine asked my press office. What do you say to critics who might think saying coronavirus was a bioweapon made to kill white and black but spare Jews might be anti-Semitic? Kennedy also demanded that the Post apologize and retract the, quote, inflammatory article.
He then shared a video with Rabbi Shmuley.
I don't answer the phone on the Sabbath. I saw that my phone was exploding with messages, ding, ding, ding over the Sabbath. I saw that the reason I was getting these messages is that my good friend, Robert Kennedy Jr., was quoted by various publications as allegedly saying that the COVID-19 vaccine was a bioweapon. And I saw that Jewish groups started condemning him as an anti-Semite.
I should say, Jonathan Levine, the reporter here for the New York Post, is a friend of mine. I know him. He's done a lot of good work in the past. From a journalistic standpoint, I don't know what the setup of this event was. RFK Jr. has said it was like off the record and has implied that this was breaking some kind of protocol.
Right.
I don't know specifically what happened here. Often it is the case, right, though, that a person will say something and later say, oh, by the way, this is off the record. You have to clarify from a journalistic standpoint off the record first. Again, I know this reporter, and I would think he'd be pretty careful with this, so I cannot speak to, like, the journalistic aspect of this. It may very well be that while they had wished it was off the record, it was not set up as an off-the-record interview, so I do just have to put that out.
Yeah, but it's also worth noting that I think I saw a lot of left criticism that was almost as frustrated or more frustrated with RFK Jr. for choosing again to foreground Rabbi Shmuley with his politics that are, I think, fairly characterized explicitly as Zionist and not especially sensitive to the interests and needs of Palestinian people. And the continued relationship between RFK Jr. and Rabbi Shmuley, recall obviously that he was deployed during his last gaffe. I don't think it's a gaffe, but when he initially threw some support behind Roger Waters of Pink Floyd for some of his politics, and then was also accused of anti-Semitism for that. He did a tete-a-tete with Rabbi Shmuley as part of his rehabilitation campaign, and the left was, at that point, skeptical if he could really advance left interest in the region if he is picking allies and bedfellows with someone as conservative as Rabbi Shmuley is. I also just want to say that last quote that we read, the framing from the Post. What do you say to critics who might think saying coronavirus was a bioweapon made to kill white and black but spare Jews might be anti-Semitic?
When did you stop beating your wife?
Exactly. Also, the argument, if you want to characterize this argument, was that coronavirus was potentially a bioweapon that disproportionately affects whites and blacks, but disproportionately doesn't affect Jewish people, Chinese people, and Amish people, and Finnish people. Mm-hmm. So it does feel like it's being weighted in a way that is suspicious. I mean, like, if you have an
supremacy.
issue, I mean,
coming for us all. And
again, I understand why there are these anti-Semitic tropes, but does it do anything to the idea that he might have been talking about science, that all of these groups were included in addition to Ashkenazi Jews? What about Sephardic Jews? What role does that play in the argument that this is an anti-Semitic trope? And also, are we concerned that it keeps being characterized as as him saying the virus was designed to spare those groups, as opposed to I think the implication is it was designed to spare the people who ostensibly, allegedly made it, the Chinese, right? And that there might be an incidental effect on other groups. Like, is the argument that they were like, we got to save the Amish from the coronavirus? I mean, the logic is all over the place, and this starts to feel like a little bit of a messy argument. Messy. I don't want to use smear, but like a little bit of a messy argument that might be politicized more than it would be if he were somebody else.
Yep. Well, that's our take. Let us know how you think about this controversy, if it is indeed a controversy, and we'll continue talking about it, I'm sure, later this week. We'll have more Rising right after this.